You don't lose your job because of one mistake. You lose it because someone decides you're replaceable. The words didn't echo out loud, but they might as well have, because that's exactly how it felt as Emma Brooks stood at the end of the long glass conference table, her fingers gripping a thin folder just a little too tightly, her knuckles pale against the soft beige paper, while 20 pairs of eyes avoided hers like looking might make it real. Alexander Hayes didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. You sent the wrong version of the contract, he said, calm, measured, final, like a judge delivering a sentence that had already been decided hours ago. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan stretched endlessly, sunlight bouncing off steel and glass, a perfect world built on precision, and Emma stood there knowing she had just disrupted it, even if only by one small, human mistake. I corrected it within 6 minutes, she said, her voice steady but softer than she intended, the kind of softness that gets lost in rooms like this. Alexander didn't even look at her fully, just a slight tilt of his head, like she was a detail he didn't need to focus on. 6 minutes is enough to lose a deal, he replied. Silence settled over the room, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioning and the distant buzz of traffic 30 floors below. Emma swallowed, her heart pounding in her chest, not from fear alone, but from something deeper, something heavier, because this wasn't just a job. It was rent, it was groceries, it was her younger brother's tuition payment due in 3 weeks, it was every late night she had stayed behind fixing schedules no one else noticed were broken. Pack your things, Alexander said, finally looking at her, his eyes sharp, distant, untouchable. You're done. The words landed harder than she expected, not because she didn't see it coming, but because part of her had believed, quietly, foolishly, that 2 years of loyalty might count for something. Around the table, executives shifted in their seats, glancing at their tablets, their watches, anywhere but at her, as if acknowledging her would make them next. Emma nodded once, a small, controlled motion, because she had learned a long time ago that dignity wasn't something people gave you. It was something you protected, even when everything else was taken away. Understood, she said, closing the folder gently, carefully, like it still mattered. She turned, heels clicking softly against the polished floor, each step measured, each breath deliberate, refusing to let them see her break. Behind her, the meeting resumed almost instantly, numbers and projections filling the space she had occupied just seconds before, as if she had never been there at all. But what none of them noticed, what Alexander Hayes didn't notice, was the small, worn notebook still resting in her bag, filled with page after page of quiet corrections, invisible fixes, and problems solved before they ever became problems, or the simple truth Emma carried with her as she walked out of that room and into a world that suddenly felt a lot colder. She had never been the mistake. She had always been the one fixing them. And for the first time in 2 years, no one was left to do that anymore. The elevator doors slid shut with a soft chime, and for the first time since she had stepped into the building that morning, Emma Brooks allowed herself to exhale, the sound barely audible, but heavy with everything she had been holding back, her reflection staring back at her from the polished steel walls, composed on the outside, but her eyes telling a different story, one of exhaustion, disappointment, and something quieter, something more stubborn that refused to break even now. She adjusted the strap of her worn leather bag on her shoulder, feeling the familiar weight of it, the notebook inside pressing gently against her side like a reminder that not everything she had built in the past 2 years could be erased with a single sentence. 30 floors above her, life continued as if nothing had happened, but down here, in the slow descent toward the street, everything felt uncertain, like stepping into a future that had not been planned. When the doors opened, the noise of the city rushed in, horns echoing, footsteps quick and purposeful, people moving with direction, with intention, and Emma stepped out into it, blending into the crowd like she always had, unnoticed, unremarkable, but never unimportant, not to herself. She walked 3 blocks before stopping at a small corner coffee shop she used to pass every morning but never had time to enter, the bell above the door chiming softly as she stepped inside, the warmth wrapping around her like something she had forgotten she needed. She ordered the cheapest coffee on the menu, counting out the last few bills in her wallet carefully, aware of every dollar now in a way she had not been just hours ago, and found a seat by the window, watching strangers pass by, as if they were part of a life she was no longer connected to. Her phone buzzed on the table, the screen lighting up with a name she could not ignore. Daniel, her younger brother. She hesitated for a moment before answering, forcing her voice into something steady, something reassuring. Hey, how was your exam? She asked, leaning back slightly, eyes closing for just a second. It went well, he said, a hint of relief in his voice. I think I did better than last time. Did you talk to your boss about the schedule next month? Emma opened her eyes slowly, staring at the condensation forming on her coffee cup, her reflection faintly visible in the glass. I did, she said after a brief pause, choosing each word carefully, like stepping stones across something fragile. We are working things out. It was not a lie, not exactly, just not the whole truth, and for now, that was enough. Good, Daniel said, exhaling, the tension easing from his voice. I was worried. Tuition is due soon, and I did not want you to have to. He stopped himself, but Emma already knew the rest. She smiled softly, even though he could not see it. I have it covered, she said quietly, the words coming out more confidently than she felt, because that was her role, always had been, the one who figured things out, the one who fixed what was broken before anyone else even noticed. After the call ended, she sat there for a long moment, the city continuing its endless rhythm outside, and slowly reached into her bag, pulling out the small notebook, its edges worn, pages filled with neat handwriting, timestamps, corrections, notes no one had ever asked for, but everyone had benefited from. She flipped through it, page after page of invisible work, of problems solved before they became disasters, and then she paused, her fingers resting on a page she had written just 2 nights ago, a note about a discrepancy in a major contract file. Something small, easy to overlook, but important enough that she had stayed an extra hour to fix it quietly without mentioning it to anyone. Emma stared at the page, a slow realization settling in, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. She had not just been part of that company. She had been holding pieces of it together. And now, for the first time, she was not there to do that anymore. Outside, a black car sped past, disappearing into traffic, and Emma closed the notebook gently, her grip firming just slightly, because somewhere between the quiet honesty of that realization and the uncertainty of what came next, something shifted inside her, not anger, not regret, but clarity. She stood up, placing the empty coffee cup back on the counter, and stepped outside again, the cool air brushing against her face, sharper now, more real, as if the world was asking her a question she had not expected to answer so soon. What happens when the one who fixes everything finally walks away? The next morning, the office felt different, though no one said it out loud, like a perfectly tuned machine, missing a single invisible gear that no one realized had been keeping everything aligned. And Alexander Hayes noticed it before anyone else did, not in a dramatic way, not all at once, but in small, irritating inconsistencies that began stacking up like quiet warnings he refused to fully acknowledge. It started with a calendar conflict, 2 high-level meetings scheduled at the same time, something that should never have happened, something that had never happened, and he stared at the screen for a second longer than necessary, his jaw tightening slightly before he dismissed it as a simple oversight from the new assistant assigned to cover Emma's role. Then came the emails, subtle errors in formatting, missing attachments, responses delayed by hours instead of minutes, the kind of inefficiencies that most people would ignore, but that Alexander noticed instantly, because precision was not just a preference to him. It was a standard he built his entire world around. Fix this, he said sharply, sliding a tablet across the desk toward the junior assistant now standing where Emma used to stand, her hands trembling just enough to betray her nerves. It should have been done already. She nodded quickly, apologizing under her breath, but her movements lacked the quiet confidence he had grown used to, and for reasons he did not care to examine, that irritated him more than the mistake itself. By noon, the tension had spread across the executive floor, a low hum of pressure that made conversations shorter, voices tighter, everyone moving just a little faster to avoid being the next target of his dissatisfaction. In the middle of it all, a notification appeared on his screen, a flagged discrepancy in a contract tied to a $90 million acquisition, a detail so small it could have easily been overlooked, but critical enough that if left unresolved, It could delay the entire deal by weeks. Alexander opened the file, scanning quickly, his eyes moving with practiced precision, and then he paused, just for a second, something unfamiliar flickering across his expression. The note attached to the discrepancy was incomplete, a half-written correction that stopped mid-sentence, as if someone had started to fix it but never finished. He leaned back slightly, his fingers tapping once against the desk, once, twice, a rhythm that usually meant he was thinking 3 steps ahead, but this time, his thoughts circled somewhere else entirely. That was when it hit him, not as a realization he welcomed, but as one he could not ignore. Emma had been working on this. He remembered the late hours, the quiet presence at the far desk long after everyone else had left, the way she would simply say, "It is handled," without explanation, without asking for acknowledgement, and it had always been enough. Until now. He straightened, closing the file with a controlled motion, his expression returning to its usual calm, but something beneath it had shifted, something subtle but undeniable. "Who reviewed this before it came to me?" he asked, his voice even but colder than before. The room went still for a fraction of a second before someone answered, hesitant. It was assigned to Emma Brooks originally. The name lingered in the air longer than it should have, and for the first time since she had walked out of that conference room, Alexander did not immediately dismiss it. Instead, he stood, grabbing his coat with a decisive movement, already moving toward the door before anyone could ask where he was going. Because for the first time, the problem in front of him was not just a mistake to be corrected. It was a gap he could not fill as easily as he thought. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a question he had never needed to ask before began to take shape, quiet but persistent. What exactly had he just removed from his own company? Alexander did not slow down as he stepped out of the building, the sharp New York air hitting his face as his driver hurried to open the car door. But for once, he waved him off without a word, his mind too occupied to settle into routine, his thoughts replaying details he had ignored for far too long, small things, quiet things, the kind that did not demand attention until they were gone. He walked past the polished black car, past the line of executives entering the building, blending into the rhythm of the city in a way that felt unfamiliar to a man who controlled so much of it from above, his coat shifting slightly with each step as he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, scrolling through emails, logs, timestamps, searching for something he could quantify, something he could measure, something that would explain the disruption in a language he understood. But the deeper he looked, the clearer it became that there was no single error to fix, no single point of failure to correct, just a pattern, a quiet, consistent pattern of adjustments, corrections, refinements that had once been there and were no longer. And every trace of that pattern led back to one name: Emma Brooks. Across town, Emma sat at a small desk in a public library, the soft hum of fluorescent lights overhead and the occasional turning of pages creating a quiet that felt almost unreal after the intensity of the past 24 hours. Her notebook open in front of her, pen moving steadily across the page as she mapped out options, expenses, timelines, the same methodical approach she had always used, because planning was how she kept control when everything else felt uncertain. Rent due in 10 days. Groceries for the week calculated down to the dollar. Daniel's tuition circled twice, underlined once. She paused for a moment, tapping the pen lightly against the paper, not out of hesitation, but out of habit, a rhythm she had developed over years of solving problems that no one else saw. Her phone buzzed again, this time an unfamiliar number, and she let it ring once, twice, before answering. "Emma Brooks," she said calmly. There was a brief pause on the other end before a voice responded, professional, slightly rushed. "This is from Hayes Corporation. We need clarification on a contract file you previously handled." Emma closed her eyes for just a second, not in frustration, not in anger, but in recognition, because she had expected this, not the call itself, but the need behind it. "I no longer work there," she replied evenly, her voice steady, her tone neutral. Another pause, longer this time. "We understand, but the file is incomplete, and the deal is time-sensitive. We were hoping you could." The sentence trailed off, unfinished, uncertain, as if even the person asking knew they had no right to. Emma looked down at her notebook, at the neatly written figures, at the careful balance she was trying to maintain, and then at the page she had left open earlier, the one with the contract discrepancy she had almost finished correcting. She could hang up. She could let them deal with it. She could protect herself the way no one had protected her. Instead, she asked a single question. What is the deadline? There was a shift on the other end, relief slipping into the voice. End of day tomorrow. Emma nodded slightly, even though they could not see her. Send me the file, she said, her tone unchanged, her decision already made. After the call ended, she sat there quietly, the weight of it settling in, not as regret, but as choice, because she knew exactly what this meant. More time, more effort, no guarantee of anything in return. She reached for her bag, pulling out a small USB drive, its surface slightly scratched from use, something she had carried with her for months, not as leverage, not as protection, but as a record, a collection of every system fix, every backup, every solution she had quietly built behind the scenes. She turned it over once in her hand, thoughtful, then slipped it into her laptop, the screen lighting up with files that told a story no one had ever asked to hear. Back on the streets, Alexander stopped abruptly at a corner, his eyes narrowing slightly as a realization settled in with a clarity he could not ignore. The problem was not just the missing fix. It was the person who knew how to see it before it became a problem at all. And for the first time in a very long time, he found himself in a position he did not like, one where control was not guaranteed, and the solution was no longer something he could command, but something he might have to ask for. By the time the file arrived in her inbox, it was already 7:42 in the evening, the library quieter now, most people gone, the soft hum of the building settling into a near silence that made every keystroke feel louder than it should, and Emma Brooks stared at the subject line for a moment longer than necessary, not because she was unsure what to do, but because she understood exactly what this meant, not just for them, but for her. She clicked it open, eyes scanning quickly, her focus sharpening almost instantly as the familiar structure of the contract unfolded across her screen. Lines of legal language, clauses, timestamps, all of it slightly off in ways that most people would miss. But to her, it stood out clearly, like a pattern she had memorized without ever trying to. They missed it, she murmured under her breath, her fingers already moving across the keyboard, pulling up previous versions, cross-checking entries, tracing the origin of the discrepancy she had noted 2 nights ago, the one she had started fixing before everything changed. Across the city, in an office still lit long after most floors had gone dark, Alexander Hayes stood near the window, his phone pressed lightly against his ear, listening as one of his senior executives spoke in clipped, tense sentences about delays, risks, potential losses that could ripple far beyond a single deal. He did not respond immediately, his gaze fixed on the skyline, lights stretching endlessly into the distance, his reflection faint in the glass, composed as always, but something beneath it no longer as certain as it once was. She is reviewing it, the executive finally added, cautiously. There was a brief pause. Emma Brooks. Alexander's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, his grip on the phone shifting slightly. And, he asked, his voice even, controlled, did she ask for anything? Another pause. No, came the answer. That was when something unfamiliar settled in. Not frustration, not irritation, but something closer to discomfort, because this was not a negotiation, not a transaction he could define or control, and for a man who built his world on leverage, that absence of expectation was harder to process than any demand could have been. Back at the library, Emma leaned closer to the screen, her brows drawing together slightly as she identified the root issue, a misaligned clause that affected 3 dependent sections, small on its own, but critical when connected, the kind of problem that required not just correction, but understanding, and she paused for a moment, her fingers hovering above the keys, because she knew exactly how much this fix was worth, not in money, but in impact. She could stop here, send a note, let them figure out the rest. Instead, she continued, methodically rebuilding the structure, line by line, restoring the integrity of the document the way she always had, quietly, precisely, without drawing attention to the fact that it needed her to function properly. Hours passed without her noticing, the numbers on the clock shifting closer to midnight as the last section finally aligned, the final clause corrected, the entire document stabilized in a way that felt almost invisible unless you knew where to look. She leaned back slightly, exhaling slowly, her eyes lingering on the screen for just a second longer before saving the file, attaching it to a reply, and typing a single sentence. The issue has been resolved. Please review section 4.2 for confirmation. No signature. No explanation. Just the solution. She hovered over the send button for a brief moment, not out of doubt, but out of awareness, because once she sent it, whatever came next would no longer be something she could control. Then she clicked. Across the city, Alexander's phone buzzed, the notification lighting up the screen in his hand, and he opened it immediately, eyes scanning the message, then the attachment, his expression shifting in a way no one else in the room would have recognized, subtle, but real. He moved to his desk, opening the file, reading through the corrections, the structure, the precision of it, and for the first time, he did not see just a solution. He saw the person behind it, the consistency, the attention, the quiet understanding of problems before they fully formed. He leaned back slowly, the weight of that realization settling in, not as a weakness, but as something far more difficult to ignore. Because this was not luck. This was not coincidence. This was something he had overlooked. And now, for the first time, he was beginning to understand the cost of that oversight. The reply came faster than Emma expected, not in words at first, but in action, the file she had sent moving through the system with a speed that told her everything she needed to know, reviewed, approved, escalated, the kind of quiet confirmation that her work had done exactly what it was supposed to do. And yet she did not feel relief, not in the way most people would, just a steady sense of completion, like closing a task that had never really belonged to her anymore. She shut her laptop slowly, the faint click echoing in the nearly empty library, and for a moment she sat there without moving, her hands resting lightly on the table, as if she were deciding something that had nothing to do with contracts or deadlines. Across the city, Alexander Hayes stood alone in his office, the corrected document still open on his screen, the final clause highlighted, precise, flawless, and undeniably hers, and he read it again, not because he needed to check it, but because he was trying to understand something he had never taken the time to see. He moved his cursor upward, scrolling through earlier versions, comparing timestamps, corrections, notes, and with each line, the pattern became clearer, not just in this file, but across others. He began pulling up old contracts, internal memos, scheduling logs, each one bearing subtle adjustments that had never been formally logged, changes that had kept things running smoothly without ever demanding recognition. His fingers stilled on the keyboard as a realization settled in, heavier now, more defined, because this was no longer about a single deal or a temporary disruption. It was about a system he had believed was efficient, flawless even, when in reality it had been quietly supported by someone he had dismissed in a matter of seconds. He exhaled slowly, stepping away from the desk, his reflection once again catching in the glass, but this time he did not look away. She fixed it, he said quietly, the words not directed at anyone, just spoken into the silence as if hearing them might make them easier to accept. His phone buzzed again, another executive calling, likely ready to move forward now that the issue had been resolved, but he did not answer immediately. Instead, he opened a new window, searching for her file, her employment records, performance reviews that now felt incomplete, insufficient, because none of them captured what he was only now beginning to understand. Meanwhile, Emma stepped out into the night, the city cooler, quieter, the air carrying that late evening stillness that softened even the busiest streets, and she walked without urgency, her bag resting against her side, lighter somehow, even though nothing in it had changed. She reached her apartment building, a modest structure tucked between two larger ones, the kind of place most people would overlook, and climbed the stairs to the third floor, her steps steady. Familiar, each one grounding her in a reality she understood far better than glass offices and million-dollar deals. Inside, the apartment was simple, clean, lived in, a small desk by the window, a couch that had seen better days, a stack of textbooks neatly arranged in the corner for Daniel's next visit, and she set her bag down gently, pausing for just a moment as her eyes moved across the space, taking in everything she was responsible for, everything she was holding together. Her phone buzzed again, lighting up the dim room, and this time she did not hesitate to look at it. Unknown number. She stared at it for a second, then answered. Emma Brooks, she said calmly. There was no immediate response, just a brief silence, and then a voice she recognized instantly, measured, controlled, but carrying something beneath it she had never heard before. This is Alexander Hayes. Emma did not speak right away, her grip on the phone tightening just slightly, not out of fear, but out of awareness, because this moment, this call, was not about a job anymore, not about a mistake or a correction, but about something that had shifted between them in a way neither of them could ignore. I received the file, he continued, his tone steady, but slower than usual, more deliberate. You solved it. Another pause, longer this time. Why? The question hung there, simple on the surface, but carrying something deeper, something that had nothing to do with contracts or deadlines. And Emma looked out the window, the city lights stretching into the distance, before answering in the same calm voice she had always used. Because it needed to be fixed. Silence followed. But it was not empty. It was full of something neither of them had named yet, something that would not disappear just because the problem had been solved. And for the first time, Alexander did not have a response ready, because for once, the answer he was looking for was not something he could calculate or control. The silence on the line stretched just long enough to become noticeable, not awkward, not uncomfortable, but unfamiliar, because Alexander Hayes was not a man who paused without purpose, and yet now for the first time in a long time, he found himself searching for words that did not come easily. He turned slightly, his gaze drifting back toward the city outside his window, the reflection of lights blurring into something less precise than he preferred. And when he finally spoke again, his voice had shifted, still controlled, but quieter, more deliberate. Remained steady, but firmer now, carrying something new. No, she said. The word landed quietly, but it carried more impact than anything else she could have said. On the other end, Alexander's hand stilled completely, the silence that followed no longer unfamiliar, but significant. No, he repeated, not as a challenge, but as if testing the reality of it. Emma nodded slightly, even though he could not see her. Systems he had always believed were under his control, and for the first time, he saw them differently, not as flawless mechanisms, but as something that had relied on someone he had never fully seen. When he spoke again, his voice carried a different weight, not authority, not command, but something closer to intention. Then I need to change the system, he said quietly, the words not just directed at her, but at himself. And for the first time, Emma did not respond immediately, because this was no longer about fixing a problem. It was about whether he was willing to understand it. The next morning, the executive floor was quieter than usual, not because there were fewer people, but because something in the air had shifted, subtle but undeniable, like the calm before a decision that would change more than just numbers on a report. Alexander Hayes stood at the head of the long conference table, the same place where he had dismissed Emma just days ago. But this time, there was no file in his hand, no immediate directive waiting to be delivered, just a room full of senior executives watching him with a kind of cautious anticipation they were not used to feeling around him. Look away. Those teams respond to problems, he replied. This role prevents them. The distinction was clear, but it carried something deeper than process, something that had not been acknowledged before. Another executive spoke, more direct this time. And who will lead this initiative? That was when Alexander straightened slightly, his expression firm, but no longer distant. Emma Brooks, he said. The name landed in the room with a quiet impact, recognition spreading across faces that had once overlooked it, and a ripple of uncertainty followed, not because they did not understand the decision, but because they were beginning to realize what it meant. She no longer works here. Someone pointed out, the statement cautious, as if unsure whether it should be said at all. Alexander nodded once. That was my decision, he said, his voice calm, but carrying a weight of accountability that had never been there before. And it was a mistake. The room went still, not just silent, but completely still, because this was not something they had ever heard from him. Not like this, not in front of everyone. He did not rush to fill the silence, did not soften the statement, because for the first time, he understood that clarity mattered more than control. She will return, he continued, not as an assistant, but as head of systems integrity, reporting directly to me. No one spoke immediately, not out of disagreement, but because the shift was too significant to process all at once, and for a moment, Alexander let that be enough. Across the city, Emma sat at her desk, the morning light filtering through the window, casting soft shadows across the notebook in front of her, her pen moving steadily as she continued outlining her next steps, her focus grounded in what she could control. Her phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with a company-wide announcement, and she hesitated for just a second before opening it, her eyes scanning the message, reading each line carefully, once, then again, as if making sure it said what she thought it did. The words were formal, structured, but unmistakable, a new position, a new system, her name placed at the center of it, not as support, not as background, but as recognition of something that had always been there. She set the phone down slowly, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the desk, her expression thoughtful, not overwhelmed, not emotional, just steady, because this was not validation she had been waiting for, not something she had needed to continue, but it was something she understood. A shift, a change, and the beginning of something that would not go back to the way it was before. She reached for her notebook, flipping it closed gently, her decision forming not from impulse, but from clarity, the same clarity that had guided her through every quiet correction she had ever made. And somewhere between the silence of her small apartment and the noise of a company learning to see differently, the distance between where she had been and where she was going began to feel a little less uncertain. Emma did not rush her decision, not because she was uncertain, but because she understood that some choices deserved more than impulse, and 3 days later, she stood once again in front of the glass building she had walked out of, the morning air crisp, the city moving around her with the same relentless rhythm. But this time, she did not feel like she was trying to keep up with it. She felt steady within it. She stepped inside, the familiar lobby stretching before her, polished floors, quiet conversations, the subtle shift of attention as a few employees recognized her, their expressions changing in ways they could not quite hide. Curiosity, respect, something that had not been there before. The elevator ride was silent, but not heavy, just quiet in a way that allowed her to remain grounded, her reflection in the mirrored walls calm, composed, exactly as she had always been, only now, she was no longer invisible. When the doors opened, the executive floor greeted her with a stillness that felt intentional, conversations pausing, eyes turning, and at the far end of the hallway, Alexander Hayes stood waiting, not behind a desk, not above anyone, just there, his posture straight, his presence strong, but different, more present than distant. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The space between them filled with everything that had changed, everything that had been understood without being said, and then he took a step forward, closing that distance in a way that was not about authority, but about acknowledgement. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice steady, but softer than it had ever been in that space. Emma nodded once, her gaze meeting his without hesitation. "I said I would consider it," she replied calmly. There was no tension in her tone, no defensiveness, just clarity. Alexander inclined his head slightly, accepting that, not pushing, not assuming. "The position is yours if you want it," he said, but this time, it did not sound like an offer made from power, it sounded like something earned, something he understood he could not demand. Emma glanced briefly down the hallway, the offices, the people, the system she had once supported quietly, and then back at him. "It is not just a position," she said, her voice even, but firm. "It is a responsibility." Alexander nodded without hesitation. "I know," he replied, "and I am ready to support it." The words were simple, but they carried something deeper than any contract could, a shift in understanding, in leadership, in the way he saw not just her, but everything she represented. Emma studied him for a moment, not searching for perfection, not expecting it, but recognizing the difference between someone who resisted change and someone who had chosen it. Then she extended her hand, a small gesture, but one that carried more weight than anything else that had happened between them. "Then I will accept," she said. He took her hand, his grip firm, but respectful, the moment brief, but meaningful in a way neither of them needed to define. Weeks later, the company moved differently, not slower, not weaker, but more aware, systems adjusted, communication clearer, problems identified earlier, not because they had been eliminated, but because they were no longer ignored. And at the center of it all, Emma worked not in the background, but in the structure itself, her voice heard, her perspective integrated, her presence no longer invisible. Alexander watched it happen not from a distance, but as part of it, learning in ways he had never needed to before, listening more, reacting less, understanding that leadership was not just about control, but about seeing what others might miss. One evening, long after most of the office had emptied, he found her at her desk, reviewing a report, the soft glow of the screen reflecting in her eyes, focused, calm, exactly as she had always been. "You have changed everything here," he said quietly, stepping closer. Emma shook her head slightly, a small smile forming, not dismissive, just honest. "No," she replied, glancing up at him. "I just made it visible." He studied her for a moment, something in his expression softening, something that had nothing to do with business or systems, but with something far more personal, something he had not expected to find. "I am still learning how to see," he admitted, his voice lower now, more open than before. Emma held his gaze, her expression steady, but warmer now, just slightly. "That is a good place to start," she said. The silence that followed was not empty, not uncertain, but full of something new, something built not on power or position, but on understanding, respect, and something that neither of them needed to rush to define, because for the first time, it was not about control, it was about connection, and that was something neither of them had seen coming, but both of them were ready to choose.